Hello and welcome to Navisto's presentation on how to create quality climate data. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about how companies can create quality data to drive action and accountability on climate change. My name is Nick Greenwood and I'm the lead climate strategy analyst at Navisto. Navisto is an ESG data management software provider which helps companies to collect ESG data, organize that data, and ultimately improve the quality of their reporting and their ESG and sustainability outcomes. We define quality climate data as data which enables economic actors to make informed decisions to achieve optimal socio-economic outcomes. In other words, data that helps actors to inform their decisions on climate change. And this data is very much in demand right now. Policymakers need climate data to measure the impacts of climate change and to assess the impacts of their climate policies. Supervisors need climate data to quantify climate risks. Financial institutions should use climate data to inform investment and lending decisions. And companies, of course, need climate data to manage their value chain impact, to assess and manage their climate risks, and ultimately show impact and monitor performance. The key point is really that climate data isn't created in isolation. It's part of an iterative and interactive process between different stakeholders within the value chain. Companies can be both preparers and users of climate data at the same time. In order for this value chain to function effectively, companies need to do two things. First of all, they need to understand how their business interacts with the external environment, and that can involve using both the company's own data, but also data that's available within that value chain. And secondly, they need to transmit that information so that others in the value chain can do the same thing. And of course, quality in means quality out. Indeed, one of the problems that we've seen to date is that the quality of climate data has been pretty poor. It's often quite patchy and incomplete. It's not always easy to compare, and sometimes it's of uncertain reliability. And this, of course, makes it very tricky for companies when they're trying to develop their own climate data and then have confidence in that data to make decisions. Fortunately, regulators are, in many jurisdictions around the world, putting in place regulation to introduce mandatory sustainability reporting. And climate change is very much leading the way in this regard, based on the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. So in the EU, we've seen, for example, the recent approval of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The US is obviously debating the SEC proposed rule on climate disclosure. And other jurisdictions, such as the UK, New Zealand, and France, have already introduced forms of climate disclosure regulation. What regulation will do is increase the availability of climate information by requiring all companies meeting certain conditions to disclose on climate change. At the same time, over the course of the summer, we've seen several proposals for draft climate disclosure standards from the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, and from EFRAG in the EU. And what these will do once implemented is increase the comparability of climate data. And finally, we're seeing moves afoot to introduce some degree of external assurance with proposals to develop sustainability assurance standards, and that will increase the reliability of climate data. We believe that these three developments are basically serving to put non-financial reporting or sustainability reporting on a similar footing to traditional financial reporting. And the goal is to create decision-grade data that can drive action. However, it would be a mistake to directly equate new climate disclosure standards to traditional financial reporting. We identify 5 ways in which climate disclosure standards are different from traditional financial reporting. First of all, there's a strong emphasis on being forward-looking. Companies will be asked to consider what the impacts of climate change will be on their business over a multitude of time horizons, including quite far into the future. Secondly, companies will be encouraged to embrace uncertainty. The new climate disclosures will ask companies to reflect on the resilience of their business model to radically different future worlds, including scenarios in which we see a significant degree of policy action, but also scenarios of less policy action and a significant increase in global warming. Thirdly, the new climate disclosure standards will require companies to be quite transparent. Companies will be asked to provide information on the potential and actual financial impacts of climate change on their activities, revenues, and expenditures. The goal is really to show that management grasps the financial implications of climate change. Fourthly, we believe the new climate disclosure standards are taking very much an integrated approach. They recognize that companies' actions and impacts are intrinsically linked to the risks that affect their enterprise value. And in this regard, we believe the new standards are beginning to blur the lines between single and double materiality. But most important of all, the new climate disclosure standards are action-oriented. They're designed to drive accountability and transformation by requiring companies to set transition plans with performance measures and targets. This is a far cry away from the world of compliance-based reports and boilerplate reports for marketing purposes. Now, while the new climate disclosure standards will significantly improve the functioning of the climate data value chain, they don't per se resolve some of the problems that companies will face in creating climate data in the first place. And there are 3 steps to doing this. First of all, companies need to identify and source raw data. Now, that raw data might lie within the company, or it might be within their value chain, or it might be in macro data sets. Secondly, companies will need to transform that data using different techniques such as scenario analysis. And thirdly, once transformed, that new climate data needs to be interrogated to derive management insights to inform strategy and to monitor progress. To give some examples, the new climate disclosure standards will require companies to disclose on their Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions, and quite possibly Scope 3 emissions in a number of jurisdictions as well. And this will require those three steps. First of all, companies will need to source raw data. That will include activity data, which is located within the company, but also activity data within their supply chain. That could be either primary or secondary data. And they'll need to combine that with macro data, for example, on emissions factors. That data will then need to be transformed using carbon accounting techniques to create new climate data or transformed data, such as emissions estimates in absolute or intensity terms. And then the most important part is that data needs to be interrogated to identify where the emission hotspots are, to develop policies to address those hotspots, and then to set science-based targets and monitor and measure progress. Similarly, for physical risk, companies will be invited to do something like estimate the amount and percentage of their business activities which are vulnerable to physical risks. And this will again require sourcing and identifying raw data. Some of that data may lie within the company in the form of asset level data on the value of their assets and the physical location of their assets. It might be data within the supply chain about location of their suppliers' assets or their customers, as well as macro data sets on climate indicators, for example, on average rainfall or heating degree days and adaptive capacity data. That data will then need to be combined using techniques such as scenario analysis and risk and financial impact assessment to produce transformed data such as climate value at risk. And again, the key point is this data needs to be interrogated to determine where the key risk areas are and to define policies to mitigate and manage those risks. Really, the crucial point here is this is not an exercise in creating data just to put it in a report. It's about creating data to inform management strategy and decisions for action on climate change. Now, of course, this is all easier said than done. For many companies, there are two challenges here. First of all, these are often unfamiliar data sets, and as we've discussed, they're not always of the best quality. But secondly, an inherent part of this involves some of the new aspects of sustainability reporting that can feel quite uncomfortable, such as looking far into the future, dealing with uncertainty, or being very transparent about financial impacts. And indeed, the TCFD's own analysis bears witness to this. For example, companies seem to be more reticent or struggle with producing disclosures on the resilience of their strategy. And that's a reflection of the fact that this involves some of the more complicated transformation techniques, but it can also be quite uncomfortable to provide information on potential financial impacts. We can also see that some performance measures prove to be particularly tricky for companies to develop, such as Scope 3 emissions or physical and transition risk measures. And TCFD analysis shows that this is essentially a data problem. It's a problem of collecting that data, collecting that raw data, identifying it, sourcing it, but also transforming that data into the performance measures that are required. So what can companies do to create quality climate data? Well, the good news is that the new climate disclosure regulations will will make data more comparable, reliable, and easy to access, and will in that way improve the quality of the climate data value chain and provide companies with data which they can use for their analysis. However, this is not a reporting exercise in its own right. Reporting can help to improve accountability and transparency, but the real goal here is to generate data to inform management insights and action on climate change. In this regard, companies may find it useful to adopt a data mindset. The old adage that you can have data without information, but you can't have information without data very much applies here. And a data focus can be very helpful in shifting the emphasis onto issues that need to be managed and measured. In this regard, digitization can be very helpful because it can help to structure that data, make it easy to do those tasks of sourcing the data, transforming it, interrogating it, and auditing it. And we've seen over the course of the last couple of years the emergence of a whole plethora of climate service providers, both consultancies and software companies that can help companies to do this. Software companies in particular have become very adept at sourcing that data and acquiring the data, transforming that data, and making it easier to interrogate it to then draw management insights and develop strategies. Ultimately, though, this is a journey of continuous improvement for all parties involved. Nobody has all the solutions. What's important really is that management grasps the importance of climate change, sets up processes to identify climate-related risks and address them, and puts in place considered transition plans with performance measures that can be used to manage and assess progress. That concludes my presentation for today. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to read more about Novisto's thoughts on this subject, I'd invite you to download our white paper, which is available on our website on navigating climate data disclosure. And of course, do feel free to drop by our booth if you'd like to discuss in more detail how Novisto is helping companies to digitize their ESG data. Thank you.